Welcome to SpringLaw's Spring Forward Legal Updates webinar series. This series is designed to provide a comprehensive legal overview of key issues related to employment law and human rights in Ontario. SpringLaw is a virtual employment law firm advising on workplace legal issues for employers, employees, freelancers, and executives from a wide range of industries. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it useful and informative. To reach our team, please visit us at springlaw.ca. And now to our presenters.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Stam, one of the lawyers at SpringLaw, and I am delighted to introduce a colleague of mine, our guest speaker, Anna Malazhavaya. I even practiced it beforehand, Anna. I'm so sorry. Tax lawyer with Advotax. But if you are one of our clients, you already know that we are an employment and labor and contracts firm. We're a virtual firm based in Ontario. SpringLaw does a free webinar once a month on the third Wednesday of each month, and we cover different topics in each webinar. And today we're going to talk about tax issues with your mobile workforce. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us in the chat. We will try and get to them, but we do have a ton to cover today. So if we don't get to your question, we'll reach out afterwards. There are slides in the handout. If you want to grab the slides as a handout, they are in the platform, so just go ahead and download them. And then if you have any other questions about our firm, just come to springlaw.ca. You can learn more about all your burning labor and employment law questions. We put a blog post up once a week. We have a monthly newsletter, a subscription program, and some innovative online programs for employers, such as our Boss Law Bootcamp. So let me introduce Anna. She is the founder of Advotax. She's a tax lawyer who helps clients who are being audited or reassessed by the CRA to help resolve their disputes with the tax authorities. She's represented her clients at the CRA level, at the tax court, and at the federal court. In addition to her tax litigation, she advises clients on a wide variety of Canadian income tax, HST, and international tax issues, and she helps business owners organize their tax affairs in the most tax-efficient manner. She is also, this is my fun fact about her, she is also the founder of Canadian Tax Nerds, which is a informal discussion and study group with over 2,000 members on Facebook of Canadian tax professionals. She's a panelist at weekly sessions at the Canadian Tax Club, and really just is one of those rare people who loves tax but can also explain it in plain English for humanity to understand. So I'm very excited to have Anna join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, and good morning, everyone.
Okay, so most importantly, let's start with a land acknowledgement. We do acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, and that this territory is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are a virtual law firm, so this applies across the country and wherever you are attending our webinar. Today is all legal information, not legal advice. We are lawyers, so no talk is complete without some sort of disclaimer. And I would like to especially encourage you to remember this when hearing Anna's, it's pretty technical. Tax law is pretty technical, and it really is fact specific so often. So we're going to give you lots of information today, but if you do have questions, you can reach out to her afterwards to retain her or someone at her firm to help you out. But in the meanwhile, today is tax information. Okay, what we are going to talk about today is a very quick overview of independent contractor versus employees, because it's very important in employment law, but it's massively important in tax law. And then what we're going to do is a choose your own adventure decision tree. We're going to try and get through these 4 scenarios. We've cheated and combined scenario 2, which is basically just swapping locations, but we will do our best to try and get through all of this. Okay, I'm going to first zip through independent contractors and employees, and then we'll turn it over to Anna for her expertise. So, we're In the world of employment law, there are two main buckets of workers in your organization. They're either an independent contractor or they're an employee. In the employee bucket, there's all kinds of sub things. They can be a fixed term, they can be part-time, they can be full-time, they can be salaried, they can be hourly, they can be indefinite. There's all different types of employee, but they're all still ultimately an employee, payroll tax, CPP, EI, etc. The independent contractor bucket is where it's more of a business-to-business type of relationship, where the worker, the contractor, takes care of their own taxes. So this is where there's a very big difference between the two. There's all kinds of considerations that you need to take into consideration when you're deciding. The courts are not going to care what you call it. They're going to simply take a look at what's actually happening and make a decision based on that. So we can have all these beautiful contracts, but it still will turn on, are they actually performing an independent contractor role, or are they actually performing an employee role? And if in doubt, I think this is the same, tell me if I'm wrong, Anna, whether it's employment law or tax, the adjudicators want to find employment status. For employment law, it's because then you're not disentitling an employee from far more generous termination benefits and rights. And then for taxes, because it's I don't know, maybe this is
For tax, I would say there is a bias that's similar. In fact, that sometimes it's more beneficial for the Canada Revenue to argue that the people are contractors, independent contractors and not employees. So unlike employment law, when the adjudicator has this natural tendency to help an employee, in tax, it's more, it's more neutral, I would say.
Oh, okay, good to know. I was getting into conspiracy land thinking that they can get more taxes out of an employee, but maybe that's not correct. So this is why don't listen to me about tax law at all. It's always Anna. Okay, so why don't we continue here? So, why the independent contractor versus employee piece matters is because it really is going to dictate what tax and employment law outcomes exist based on that particular type of relationship. And we are in this new era of a workforce, this post-pandemic workforce, where everybody isn't just sitting and working in the same building as their employer in the same jurisdiction. There's so much mobility now. So, the new era really is testing all of our understanding around conflict of laws, which province, which state, which country law applies, as well as just, on the employment law front, all kinds of fundamentals like non-competes and that kind of thing that are getting tested all over the place because of the new workforce that we're in. In general, starting points for all of these issues around your new mobile workforce is a starting point, but not the end point. For tax law, follow the money where it's earned and when it crosses borders. Would you say that's right, Anna? I just want to confirm everything.
Starting point is this. The takeaway is this. Whenever you see money crossing borders, there is a very high chance that you may benefit from advice of a tax professional. Call your accountant, at the very least, call your accountant, and if they tell you to call your tax lawyer, then call your tax lawyer. Because the moment any funds cross borders, that's when we get all kinds of different issues that are very complex, can get very complex, and can have massive implications for both employees and employers, or workers or independent contractors and payors. Okay,
that's very helpful. For employment law, a starting point to consider is, where does the employee actually live? That's going to trigger certain employment liabilities and employment standards, for example. And then for corporate law, neither of us are experts on that, but figuring out, has an establishment been created in that jurisdiction? So if you open up a new store, anyways, Anna will get into all this. I'm not going to go into details yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk through these 4 examples of employees living in a different location for each from where their employer is. So I've put in here workplace headquarters. we're going to probably use the word headquarter, but it could be a sub that is the employer, for example. But it's where is the employer who's paying the check? Where do they live versus where is the employee living? And then what is their citizenship status? Okay, let's dig in somehow in 20 minutes. All right. So case study number 1, Ahmed. He lives in Ontario, or sorry, his employer is Ontario. He's a Canadian citizen, and he wants to work in Alberta. He lives in Calgary. He now would like to rent an office there because his kids are interrupting him at home. They have a tiny condo, and so he has asked his company, "Can you contribute to my condo, or not my condo, to my office in Alberta?" Over to you, Anna.
Okay, it's tempting. It's only $1,500 a month, right? It's tempting to rent a small office in Calgary. I hope prices are not as crazy as they're in Toronto. So it's tempting to make that arrangement to make Ahmed more productive. But let's see what happens on the tax side here. So you see the decision tree, and the different colors in the decision tree represent different reasoning that you have to go through with your tax advisor, or at least at first on your own. So the first question I normally ask is whether or not the Ahmed is an employee or an independent contractor. And the criteria to determine that were just above on one of the previous slides, but note how different the life is now after COVID in a remote environment. In the old days, the fact that an employee would not work in the office in and itself was a very serious factor in favor that the person was an independent contractor and not an employee. Now, it's absolutely not the case. The very fact that Ahmed is not working in the office of his Ontario employee does not matter that he's an independent contractor. He can't be an employee. So go through that analysis carefully with your advisors. So if Ahmed is an employee, let's see if ITCO has a place of business in that other province, i.e. in Alberta, and whether that place of business is owned or rented. So in this case right now, Ahmed is working from his home, but he's not comfortable. His small children are interrupting him. So he wants to rent, he wants the employer to rent a small office in Alberta. So he may have a rented office in Alberta. So yes, let's move to the next square. Consult with your tax advisor whether or not ITCO has a PE in the other province. So by renting that office for Ahmed, you may end up having a PE in Alberta. If you have a PE in Alberta, that would be no different than opening a full, complete office with a reception or, warehouse in Alberta. You would have the same tax implication as you would by simply renting a small, tiny office for Ahmed to work remotely. And if you have a PE in the province, you would have to then determine income tax liabilities in the other province and track profits for your enterprise from Alberta. So you would have to pay someone to figure out to apportion your profits to Alberta based on what Ahmed is doing. So that's not an easy exercise. Your accountants will not like you if you can avoid it by simply, maybe, not renting an office for Ahmed. That may be worth it, despite the inconveniences he's facing. Now, let's look at the purple decision tree. If Ahmed is an employee, the employer would have to make withholdings. That's no different, nothing new there. And then the question is, which rates do we apply? The employer is in Ontario, but Ahmed is in Alberta. So the CRA provided an interpretation where they say that if Ahmed has to report to the IT course establishment in person, either all the time or sometimes, either it's an in-person role or a hybrid role, then ITCO must make withholdings based on Ontario rates. If Ahmed is completely removed, then in the first case, the rates applicable will be the Alberta rates. But if Ahmed is completely removed, the rates applicable will be the rates of ITCO's payroll department, i.e. Ontario. So Ahmed, even though he will be working in Alberta, will be subject to withholding at Ontario rates. But when it's time for him to prepare to file his tax returns in April of the following year, he will ask his accountant to report what was withheld and maybe get a refund if too much was withheld, which would be the case probably in the case of Alberta in Ontario. Alberta rates are lower. So that's the decision tree on that on the withholding part. If Ahmed is an independent contractor, so we would have to figure that out. Ahmed and maybe the PR2 should talk to their tax advisors about the HST GST implications, and they will depend on the nature of services Ahmed provides. So that's your case scenario number one.
Anna, we have a quick question about the orange decision tree. What if the answer is no on each of them? So if
let's go through that scenario. So if ITCO does not have a business in the a place of business in the other province, i.e. Alberta, and if ITCO does not have a PE in Alberta, then we don't have a PE problem. A PE problem is a problem when the enterprise has to treat that PE permanent establishment as a separate branch in a different province and has to determine their tax liability in that different branch. So if the answers to those questions are no, then we are more or less comfortable that we don't have a PE. We don't have to calculate our income in Alberta, apportion our income to Alberta. So our accountants are much happier. But the PE, the notion of PE is quite complex. It's complex on the provincial side of things. It's also complex on the international. It's even more complex on the international side of things. So try not to assume too much. And if you have someone crossing borders, working in another province, especially if someone is not working from their home, always talk to your tax advisor.
So if they are just working from their home in Alberta for an Ontario employer, that's the simplest scenario.
That's the simplest scenario that the CRA has confirmed is not a PE. So don't worry, you don't have the orange problem.
Okay.
But anything more than working from home, you may have a PE. Like, let's say, showing up at some, Regis office. I don't know what what Regis. These are like workplaces, work sharing arrangements. So if your employer carries on their duties in a location other than their home somewhere, and that looks like that location can be it looks like it's more or less permanent, then talk to your tax advisor about determine whether or not it's a PE.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
For provincial purposes.
Awesome. We have a second question, but it's around what if the employer is actually in the US, but we're going to get to that in one of the other scenarios. So let's move on to case study number 2. We have Barb, who the employer is located in the US. She is Canadian, and she's working here in Ontario.
Okay, so here it will be Barb's description of her duties will be interesting too. So Barb in this case, so US is a marketing company. And Barb is a project manager who works from her home in Toronto, and she's been overseeing a large contract for USCO in Canada for the past 4 years, and she works under a contract and gets $100 US per hour. So again, we have a slightly different decision tree here because we are crossing borders. And here the notion of PE that we kind of referred to in the previous case study becomes even more important. Your advisors should carefully consider whether or not Barb would have a PE. And we'll get to that later, but overall, just so we're clear on what PE is, permanent establishment is a generally defined term under Canada double treaties. And it's generally defined, so here I have an example, a summary of Canada-US treaty. Different treaties may have different definitions, but overall the essence of it is similar, although the Canadian treaty has its wrinkles that tax advisors need to be aware of. So PE really is a fixed place of business, fixed place of business. So it can be a branch, an office, a factory, a workshop, a mine, an oil or gas well, and so similar establishments. There are also deemed PE tests in the Canada-US treaty that's been subject to many research papers in the tax world. So a US business will be deemed to have a PE in Canada if a US business has a person working in Canada and habitually exercises in Canada an authority to conclude contracts in the name of a US entity. So whenever you have remote workers, it depends on what their duties are. If you have someone very senior or executive level employee who is has authority to sign contracts on behalf of your enterprise, what you may be doing by allowing him to work remotely, you may be establishing EPE in the US with everything that comes with it. And then there is the services PE test, the single individual test. So if you have an individual present in Canada for 183 days or more, in any 12 months period, and during the period more than 50% of gross income derived from services in Canada by that individual, so that's the single individual test. 50% of gross income, that sounds like a large number to like a serious test to me, but I've seen it being met in the case of law firms. You know, if you have your top producer associates working from a Muskoka cottage for a US law firm, guess what you have in Canada? You have a services PE. And there's this enterprise test for PE, where services provided in Canada for an aggregate of 183 days or more in any 12-month period with respect to the same connected projects for customers who are residents in Canada and who maintain a PE in Canada. So as you can tell, the definition is quite complex. So if you have any doubts, talk to your tax. And the next slide would be the decision tree that we would follow if we have a situation where we have USCO marketing and Barb. Okay, so first, USCO needs to figure out, do we need, for every paycheck they have for Barbara, do they have any withholding obligations? So again, first question, that's the blue color of reasoning. Is Barbara an employee or an independent contractor? If she is an employee, chances are, yes, they will have obligations to withhold and register with the Canadian Revenue Agency and get a business number and file T4 slips. And there are serious penalties for non-compliance. So really, they will be treated by the Canadian tax authorities as if they're local Canadian payors or employers. You don't get a break simply because you're not as an employer, simply because you're not in Canada. Now, there is something called section regulation 102 waivers, and so in certain cases, if treaty relief is available to you or your employer, or your employee, so these obligations can be waived. But talk to your tax professional about that if that applies to you. By default, if you have an employee in Canada, you have to withhold and make payments to the CRA. That's your problem right away. Okay, so is Barbara an independent contractor? And here, note that it's not that easy of a question whether she was an employee or an independent contractor. She works on contracts. She doesn't really work on the. She may or may not be integral to the entire business. She charges hourly rate. So here it's really hard question whether or not she's an employee or an independent contractor. So talk to your tax advisor about it. And is she a resident of Canada? If she is a resident of Canada, then there is no withholding obligation for the U.S. employer. It's no different than hiring any business in Canada. So then the arrangement is treated as business-to-business arrangement. It's as if I want to hire a marketing consultant in the U.S. And I pay them $1,000 and we part ways after the project. That's how it's treated. So there's no withholding or anything else. It's not my employee. That person would have their own obligations to meet in front of their own local tax authority. So in this case, if Barbara is a resident of Canada, it's her problem to report everything she earned to the Canadian Revenue Agency. And, whether or not she needs to charge HST, GST, that's her question to figure out. She needs to talk to her advisors. If she is not a resident of Canada, then talk to your tax advisors about possibly Reg 105 obligations for USCO.
Anna, we have a question if Barb's an employee, which province is her? If there's no PE in Canada, what would be her province? Just where she lives?
Yes, so that would be her where she's located.
Okay, perfect. Oh, and then never mind to the last question, I guess. I didn't read that quick enough because we did answer it. All right. Go ahead.
Okay, and then the green part of the decision tree is what does USCO have to do in Canada? So they have to, number one, confirm whether or not they carry on business in Canada. And the threshold is usually very low. Like if you don't have to do much to be considered to be carrying on business in Canada. In most cases, the courts and the CRA will say, no, you're here in Canada, you're selling to Canadians, so you're doing anything business related to Canadians. In Canada, you're carrying on business in Canada. Now, consult with your tax advisor whether or not USCO is a resident of Canada-US treaty. This is a very complex technical subject. I'm not going to go into it, but it's a necessary step in the analysis. And last but not least, figure out if you have a PE in Canada as a result of Barbara, living here, working here, signing contracts here, carrying on business here, and making money for your company here. And that's when that loan slide becomes about the definition of PE. That's when it becomes important. Somebody needs to advise provide advice to USCO as to whether or not Barbara creates a PE for USCO in Canada. And if yes, USCO now has a permanent establishment in Canada. Congratulations! It's no different than opening a new branch. That's how little it may take. So when you open a new branch, when you're at an office and people, you kind of notice that this is happening. But something like Barbara may not be even noticed by businesses. How can Barbara alone create a PE? She can, and if she does, then U.S. has to attribute and file tax returns in Canada and pay, has certain tax obligations in Canada, and you add a significant burden to your tax compliance people. And if not, still consult with your advisor on your filing or reporting obligations in Canada, because that may exist as well. Really, consult your tax professionals.
So to
Never matter.
Sorry, Anna, I talked over you.
No.
Okay, so to try and avoid having the PE being established, try and stick to an independent contractor relationship where possible, especially if it's only one person in the country, right?
It seems to be an easier, cleaner solution for tax purposes, but I can understand that in many cases people need that control over their workers, and they don't want to allow the tax tail whale their business dog. At the end of the day, it's their business; they carry it on the way they want to. So there may be different things, but if you have a choice, it's better not to have a PE than to have a PE.
Right. Okay. And I know that it's 11 o'clock, and so what I recommend is that we do this. This is where Barb is now still Canadian but living in the U.S. For an Ontario. So we've just swapped it on the other direction, and then. We'll see with the number of attendees if we want to continue going through the rest, but probably wrap up. And then if you have questions, just reach out to Anna or I after. But what would happen if Barb is instead working from her beach house in California for that same Canadian employer, but she's in Ontario and the employer is now in Canada? Okay, so just to clarify, the employee location that's in the U.S. Okay, so if we have a Canadian employer who with Barb, who is a very valuable worker, and she wants to work from her beach house in California, pretty much the same considerations will apply. You just, you would have different, you would need to consult with a U.S. tax advisor on what it is that Barbara creates for you in the U.S. The questions will be the same. The tests and the filing obligations, the reporting obligations may be quite different, but the analysis will be similar. So they will look at whether or not Barb is an independent contractor or an employee. They will look at whether or not you have a PE in US, whether or not you've created a PE for yourself in California, whether or not you now have to report, file tax returns, pay taxes in California, apportion the revenues of your enterprise to the revenues that Barbara created for you. And your withholding obligations, which are very different in Canada and can be very complex on the state and even on the city level. So in this situation, your first call should be to U.S. tax advisor. And we've had clients that they do value the Barb, and they want to, if she wants to go live in California, great. And so we've had it where clients will then negotiate with their valuable employee. Okay, fine, now you can be an independent contractor, thinking that will solve all the problems. And so then Barb goes off to California, lives there, for a year as an independent contractor. And what I've advised on the employment law side is that if she's doing the same job, has the same responsibilities, just doing everything remote, from an employment law point of view, it's fairly certain a court will deem her to be an employee anyways, even though we all want to call it a contractor. Is that similar for tax? Identical, I agree. Okay. So yeah, it's unless you radically change the job, and actually make it a contractor role. But that's, once a person's embedded in an organization, that becomes difficult to do. Okay, I'm mindful of time. I'm thinking to jump over to the key takeaways. I know there's many other scenarios that employers are dealing with of people living in different countries altogether besides the US and Canada. A lot of our clients are dealing with people who are going between these two countries. But if you have examples in your workplace where you have someone outside of North America, absolutely feel free to reach out to Anna directly and retain her to give you a hand on your specific issues. Basically, some of our key takeaways start with that employee and contractor analysis all the time. As you can see, that drives everything. Know whether or not you're establishing a PE, and just follow that movement of money across borders. There will usually be some sort of tax input. Anna, did you have any key takeaways you wanted to point out?
No, thank you so much for having me. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. This was fun.
Great. So just before we fully wrap up, if you are an employer in Canada and you have employees across different provinces in Canada, we have a national employment contract that you can come to our website and download that is good for all the jurisdictions, except for Quebec. It's always except for Quebec. That's a separate one, but we work with a lawyer out of Quebec that we can absolutely pull in and give you a hand on your Quebec contract through him. So, but if you want to just go onto our website, you can download that, purchase it directly from our website. Okay, I know that we talked about a dense and complicated area of law today. So normally we open up to questions, but we've hit our time. Again, thank you for attending. If you have any further questions, reach out to any of us. Our next webinar will be on June 21st at 10:30, so the third Wednesday of the next month. And we're going to be talking about labor law litigation, probably some employment law litigation, but really digging into the world of labor. We have a pretty robust labor practice here at SpringLaw, so we're going to be going through some of the basics around that. If you have any other questions, reach out or come to our website, springlaw.ca. Please feel free to follow us on our social channels. This webinar is recorded and will be dropped onto our YouTube channel within a day or two, so you can check out there. Join our monthly newsletters, and don't forget to join Anna's Tax Nerd group. Jess, who's working behind the scenes with us, dropped the link to that in the chat, so make sure you grab that and go join her nerd group, her tax nerd group. Thank you, Anna, for joining us today. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for having me.